SoundCartel.
COVID has had a huge impact on the way we've worked and lived for more than a year. But what has it meant for audio consumption habits? For answers, we speak to Larry Rosin, president of Edison Research, about the results from their Infinite Dial 2021 Australia survey. And he explains how podcasting fared over a very unexpected last 12 months.
There's this old expression, it takes 30 days to make a habit. Well, a lot of these new behaviors we're well over a year into. And so those are well-developed habits at this point. It's not just this temporary thing. So new habits have been formed, and unforming them or reverting to the lives we led in 2019, I think is extremely unlikely.
I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of audio agency SoundCartel. And this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 7 of season 5. And joining me is producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hello there, Nick. Good to be back for another episode. Now, as we get into the interview with Larry, it's worth a reminder that along with Triton Digital and Commercial Radio Australia, this is the 5th year that the Infinite Dial Australia survey has been produced by Edison Research.
Yes, it really has become a trusted and go-to reference for our industry. It's such a comprehensive study of digital media behaviour, tracking developments across online audio, radio, in-car, audio streaming services, smart speakers, and of course, podcasting.
And for a snapshot of where Australian podcasting is at, we can actually pull out a few stats that show podcasting has thrived during the pandemic.
Yes, it really did. Podcasting awareness jumped to 91% here in Australia, ahead of the US, which increased to 88%. It really is still that anomaly in the stats where Australia leads the US. Although keep in mind that 88% in the US is a whopping 242 million people aged over 12, so not a small audience.
No, and our weekly and monthly listener numbers also doubled. Weekly from 17 to 26% and monthly from 25 to 37%.
Yeah, that's really encouraging and catching up to the US, which is interesting. Smart speaker ownership also grew significantly, which makes perfect sense when we were all stuck at home. Not surprisingly, the biggest growth was in the category of owning 3 or more smart speakers, which I guess, again, makes sense as people added to their collection around the house.
Yeah, exactly. And so with all this excitement in mind, let's get to the Edison Research President, Larry Rosin, and see what he has to say about the year that was. Larry, welcome back to Podcasting Essentials. It's great to have you with us.
Hey, Larry, great to have you here.
And I'm excited to be here again.
Larry, the last time we spoke, it was still the early days of COVID, and we talked about the changes in audio listening behaviours, in particular, pre- and post-2020. Now that we're somewhat on the other side of the pandemic, what listening habits do you think have changed forever and which are reverting to pre-COVID times?
Yeah, it's still early to tell how things are going to shake out. When we talked about a year ago, many parts of the world were in deep lockdown and people weren't leaving their houses at all. And for people who could work from home, they transitioned their work to home. And there is still no doubt that some of that is going to stick. Some form of hybrid will come out on the other side. And there's definitely people who transition to home and are never going back. They like it too much and their employers are okay with it. And that ripples through audio on every level. Obviously, the car is a big place for audio consumption. And it's not just the car. I mean, people make different choices working from home than working in a workplace. That really has been the main story. And then there's smaller stories as well, which is people with their lives upended and changed have explored new things. Streaming video has had a really big year with people having bought that commute time back and just sort of looking for things to do when they're not going out as much. Video gaming. And then even in the audio space, there was a very, very good year for podcasting, as an example. After an initial time of disruption when things really changed a lot, podcasting really seemed to zoom forward in the last year. So lots of changes, quite a year.
Yeah, we've talked about podcasting being pandemic proof, which was quite a relief. We weren't so sure early on, but it certainly turned out that way. What do you think is the single best thing to have changed in the audio and podcasting space in the last year?
Well, podcasting, just keeps seeing so much development, creativity, new approaches, celebrities launching podcasts. And it's in this very virtuous cycle right now where more money is coming in, therefore attracting more talent, attracting more interest, which leads to more investment at the moment and more excitement. And in our American research, we saw a big increase in podcast consumption. In the Australian research we did, we saw an even bigger increase in podcast consumption. So for the moment, there's tons of momentum, there's tons of excitement, and a real burst of creativity as well. So for now, people continue to learn about the medium, learn what they like, discover new things, and it's still in that very exciting sort of early development period. There's no doubt it will hit its teenage years and then maybe its early adult years and more mature time, but it's not there yet. It's still in that rapid development mode.
Well, I don't want to dampen the mood, but have there been any negative changes that brands should be cautious of?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's always risk if you're partnering with someone, if you're sponsoring certain forms of content. By far, the biggest podcast here in the United States is something called the Joe Rogan Experience. I don't know how much it's listened to down there, but part of the reason he's so popular is he touches on often very controversial subjects. And there are plenty of advertisers who don't want to be supporting environments that can be quite so risky or risque. I mean, this is a guy who, there's a video version of his podcast, and he's quite clearly, smoking his reefer and touching on often very controversial topics. And again, that's a big part of the reason it's so popular and so well listened to. But there are risks involved if you're seen as supporting certain points of view that are seen as way out of the mainstream. And so I do think that's one. By the same token, advertisers who advertise on that show, you hear great stories of tremendous response. People are very loyal to the show, very loyal to him. And when he puts out the word that you're sort of helping him and helping his show by patronizing his sponsors, the results seem to be tremendous, as results tend to be in the whole podcasting space. So it's a mixed story, but of course there's always some risk involved. And then in the whole world of programmatic, where you're just sort of sometimes just firing the spots out there and you don't really even know where they're landing, of course you have the same risks. But by and large, it's been, as an advertising medium, it still commands really, really good rates. And I think even at those really good rates, it's kind of a bargain because the results that you hear about are really, really good.
Now, Larry, let's get into the Infinite Dial surveys. In the US, they date back to 2006. And in Australia, this is the 5th year that Edison Research has done a specific survey. And the data's now starting to show some interesting trends. And it's fair to say that the lag behind the US is diminishing. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think it's exciting. I wonder how the weird year of 2020 played into that. We started 5 years ago, as you said, doing the Infinite Dial Australia. And we were typically seeing, as we compare the numbers we see in the American version to the Australian version, that on many areas of digital audio and digital development, that Australia was a year behind, 18 months behind, 6 months behind the American numbers. And those numbers caught up dramatically this year. My sense is that when it comes to podcasting in particular, maybe things just sort of finally clicked. Maybe the disruptions in life that so many people had opened up, hey, let's try something new. I have a little more time on my hands and I've heard about this so much. I have commented each of the previous years with Infinite Dial Australia that as more bespoke Australian content is created, and not just catch-up radio, but podcasts that are made by and for Australians, that I think that will help close the gap. And by everything I've come to learn, this was a great year for bespoke Australian content. And so I think that has to have helped. There's more shows about topics that Australians care about, because there's a limitation on shows from the UK or from America. Those are not going to be quite as relevant, of course, naturally. So as you guys have developed your own local podcast infrastructure on top of catch-up radio, which I think, frankly, down under you guys, it's almost over-defined podcasting as simply the chance to hear a radio show that had run previously, which is of limited interest to many people. So now that you have both layers, you can catch up on radio and you can listen to bespoke podcasts made by and for Australians. I think that's probably a big part of the reason that the gap closed.
Well, following on from that, Larry, podcasting awareness is actually one area that Australia does exceed the US. In the latest survey, Australia's jumped to 91% awareness of podcasting, with the US still at 78%. Why does Australia continue to power ahead?
Yeah, that's always been one of the most interesting things when we've compared the American and Australian data is all along awareness of the term podcasting, awareness of the idea of podcasting, it's always been higher in Australia than it was in the US. But at the same time, listening to podcasts was always higher than we saw in Australia. So it was this interesting duality. As I said, it's still behind, but this year listening to a podcast caught up quite a bit. The theory I always had, and I still think it's what was behind this, was related to catch-up radio and things like that I was talking about. Radio is really strong in Australia, commercial radio, public radio, and they were talking about their podcasts all the time. And I think that's what was driving it. So people listen to the radio, they like radio in Australia, they heard the radio entities promoting their podcasts. But as I said, they were promoting essentially, did you miss this show or did you miss the highlights of this breakfast show? Now you can listen to it as a podcast. And that promise in and of itself lacked appeal for some people. So that's how I always justified in my own head why we saw these interesting results where awareness was higher, but listening was lower. And each year we come back and each year the awareness goes yet higher. It's almost as high as it can get at this point. And I think now that awareness is more rapidly turning into uptake of actual usage.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. You mentioned that there has been a jump in weekly and monthly listenership based on the most current survey. This time last year, actually, Larry, I don't know if you remember, but you predicted on this podcast that we would see a jump in monthly and weekly listening. The numbers, just in case people are interested, monthly listening has jumped from 25% to 37% and weekly listening from 17% to 26%. And both are now right on the tail of the US figures, as you said. Why were you so confident that this would be the trend here in Australia?
Well, I'm certain I predicted that it would continue to grow. I'm not sure I would have guessed that it would grow quite so much, but of course I also wouldn't have predicted a global pandemic and everything that's happened in the last year. I knew what was happening with the creation of new podcasts and how much development was going on down there. So there's a lot of resources being thrown at development of new podcasts down there. And so that was not a really risky bet that I was making, that it would be a good year for podcasting. Again, we have all the American experience to compare to. And you were tracking all along, and in as much as the numbers keep going up in the United States, there was no good reason why your numbers wouldn't go up. I wouldn't have and didn't, I don't think, predict that they would go up quite so dramatically and quite so much. But it's very exciting to see.
Yeah, it's fantastic to see not only the audience size growing, but the number of good podcasts being produced as well. And I think there is definitely a correlation between those two things. In-car listening has jumped from 14% to 30%. Is this a result of in-car entertainment systems making it easier to listen, or are there other factors at play?
I think they're all connected. I'm sure that's part of it, that it's easier to do. But also there's just a lot of evidence that once people sort of get into podcasts, they fill up more of their available time with them. I would assume that for some people, the nature of time spent in the car changed as well during this weird year, so that might have been a factor too. But the evidence is once people get into it, especially, for sort of bingey podcasts, the sort of short form narrative shows, sometimes if you're listening to a whodunit true crime podcast or something like that, you may have experienced this yourself, or at minimum, people who you get in there and you really want to find out how it ends. And so you're going to take it from your home into your car if you have that availability. So I assume those numbers are all just sort of connected to each other.
And potentially people doing more driving as well, because we can't travel overseas, as we all know at the moment from Australia. So people are jumping in their cars or hitching up the caravan and taking trips around Australia. And I know from firsthand that people ask me for podcast recommendations when they jump on the road. And
we're going to see that here this summer. I mean, international travel is next to impossible. So everything is about domestic travel. And a lot of that is done by car here. And we're very car oriented. And so when you're loading up for a 6-hour, 10-hour, 14-hour drive or something like that, the days of frantically tuning to try to find a new radio station, it seems a little outdated when you can load a podcast or a bunch of podcasts in, and you're not going to drive out of signal range of the podcast you're listening to straight off your phone.
Larry, a quarter of Australian households now own a smart speaker, which is a little behind a third of the homes in the US. But in both cases, there was a large jump in 2020. So how do you think brands should approach an audio strategy for smart speakers?
So there's a lot going on with that. First of all, anything that related to things being done at home had a big year. I mean, furniture stores had a good year. Any kind of home improvement stuff had a good year. People were spending more time at home, and so they finally noticed that couch is ratty and it's time to replace it, and things of that nature. It makes sense that people went out and acquired them, and it became a smarter value proposition, and maybe they knew friends who had one and they thought it was cool and they decided to get one for themselves. So there's every good reason why smart speakers had a good year. There's also a lot of evidence that people who had one, maybe in the kitchen, got a second one for the bedroom, or vice versa, or a third one in some cases, or even more. I will say that no one, not Google, not Amazon, not Apple, has really cracked podcast listening and made it easy in a smart speaker environment. I know Apple recently announced what to me seems like the most straightforward thing, which is to understand with a given podcast, whether it's the kind you want to start at the beginning, one of these narrative-based podcasts, or one that you would want to listen only to the most recent episodes, say one that talked about current events or the news or things like that. Because it was hard sometimes to just find the episode of a podcast that you wanted to listen to. They all defaulted to the most recent episode, and not everyone wants to listen to the most recent episode, nor does anyone want to go to the effort of casting something off their phone to the smart speaker. That's just more effort than it's worth. So podcasting it's a huge opportunity on smart speakers that makes all the sense in the world. It hasn't been easy enough, but I think it's becoming easier, and I think all three of the big companies, Google, Apple, and Amazon, are working to make podcasting an easier experience on the smart speaker. It's absolutely happening, but it lags things like just playing music, which is a relatively straightforward experience on a smart speaker, an easier hurdle to jump, if you will. I will mention, as a little preview, that we have done for many years a study here in the United States called the Smart Audio Report, which looks at smart speakers and looks at consumption on smart speakers and also the use of voice assistants on phones and things like that. We will be debuting Smart Audio Report Australia in just a matter of weeks. The promotion should go out any day now. So a little bit of a scoop for you guys, which we are doing in partnership with Commercial Radio Australia as well, and a few other partners. So a lot of data to come about smart speakers in Australia. And again, the comparisons that we can make to the data we have from American research.
That's really exciting. That's great.
Just to finish, can you quickly polish off that crystal ball? What's going to be the biggest change in the next Infinite Dial?
Well, I touched on this at the beginning, which the huge question is how much does the rest of 2021 and say early 2022 look like 2019? There's no way that life in any developed country is going to revert to what it was like in 2019. The only question is how much reverts to what it was like in 2019. Because there's going to be people who just like better the life they lived through 2020 and into 2021, as well as scarring effects. There's this old expression, it takes 30 days to make a habit. Well, a lot of these new behaviors we're well over a year into. And so those are well-developed habits at this point. It's not just this temporary thing. So new habits have been formed, and unforming them or reverting to the lives we led in 2019, I think is extremely unlikely. And as an example, going to a movie theater, people got out of the habit in a big way, at least here in North America. And I happen to love the movies, and lots of people love going to the movies and that sort of communal experience. But by the same token, a lot of people experienced how well they can recreate that in their own living rooms. And they can pause the movie and go to the bathroom or whatever, do what they need to do. And there's things that are better and things that are worse about it. And some people who were movie theater goers, I think, are just going to stick on their couches and say, I'd rather just stream the movies going forward. Translating that over to the audio space, some people are going to go back to commuting 5 days to a workplace who weren't. And some people are not. Some people will go to 3 days. Some people will stick at 0 days. That has an enormous ripple effect on audio consumption. People tried new things, like we were talking about podcasting. You guys all know this. Many people, when they fall down the rabbit hole of podcasting, never emerge. And so they change their audio behaviors dramatically because they really like podcasts and they like the unique content and sort of the on-demand experience, kind of like I was saying with movies. And they won't revert back because they've gotten used to that. I don't think there's a lot of doubt that the bookshelves will be filled with books about before and after 2020 and what profound changes happened. But when it comes to the audio space, a lot of things that we kind of thought might happen over 3 years or 5 years or 10 years sort of got smushed together and happened in a very, very short time. And I just don't know that we'll see tons of reversion. And so that's not much of a prediction, but like I said, I wouldn't have predicted a global pandemic either. So predicting the future is really hard. And trying to get a sense for what things will be like even a month from now is so difficult. I mean, we're seeing it here already. We did surveys of people just in March, and we'd ask questions about, once you're vaccinated, do you think you will do these things? And people, in many cases, said no. But then if you re-interviewed them after they got the vaccination, they said yes. So the point being, their brains couldn't push themselves into that vaccinated life. They couldn't even imagine it. They needed the vaccine in order to imagine being able to, wanting to do things again or being willing to do things again. So it's just really hard. People themselves don't know what they even want to do. So predicting at the large level is just really, really hard. I'm an old guy. I've been doing this for a long time. There's been never anything remotely like what's happened in the last year. So it's very hard to predict.
It is, but I think the good news is that the gains made in podcasting are here to stay.
Yeah.
Might flatten out a little bit in growth, but it's still heading in the right direction, which is fantastic.
I think the safe bet from last year remains the safe bet for this year. I think it's very likely that podcast, hopefully when we do Infinite Dial 2022 and we get together again, we will see that it grew once again. It's still in, like I said earlier, I think it's still in a relatively early phase of development. And it's still in that buzzy world where, someone is saying to the next person, have you heard this new podcast? Or did you listen to this? Or I love that. And it's got that kind of momentum behind it. So like I said, maybe it won't see the big jump that it saw in the last year, but I think the odds are way better that we'll see more growth than even flattening.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Larry. And hopefully we'll see you in Australia for the 6th edition of the Infinite Dial. But until then, stay safe and thank you very much for joining us on Podcasting Essentials.
Thank you, Larry. Incredibly insightful as usual. Thank you so much.
Of course, happy to do it.
The trend I like most is that once people get into podcasts, they fill more of their available time with them. But all these habits will be interesting to watch over time, and as Larry said, working arrangements for many could change more permanently now, so that increase in concentrated listening could definitely continue.
Yeah, that's right. And for brands in particular, podcasting has once again proven its resilience. We can't forget that it took 7 years for ad revenue in this medium to reach $1 billion. It's now set to double by 2022 to $2 billion.
Yep, it's definitely taking off. It's quite incredible.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me.
A wondrous time, as usual. Thank you, Nick.
For more about us and how we can help you produce a podcast, you can visit soundcartel.com.au or our socials at SoundCartelAU.
And as we continue to navigate the winding road ahead, if you're after business insights and inspiration each morning, do check out our daily podcast, Business Essentials Daily, wherever you're listening right now.
From the team at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.